Christian Watkins. Welcome to Re-Enchantment.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Or rather, welcome back to Re-Enchantment, because we tried to do this episode a couple weeks ago and technical problems just scuttled the whole thing.
It's exciting to be back. It's always good to see your face and to hear your voice.
All right, so let's give people a little bit of an introduction to who you are and how we met.
Do you want to do the Met part, or do you want me to do the Met part?
Well, okay, so we met back when we were at Yale, and it was, what was it? It was a sociology class. I was considering doing sociology.
Yes.
And you happened to be in a sociology class that I was auditing. And then we really met when we were dancing. We started dancing swing and blues, and that was kind of like our relationship was forged on the dance floor.
For those of you who do not know or have not danced with Daniel, he's an excellent dancer, and it was a lot of fun to dance with you. And I thought, he's got to be a good human if he's this good at dancing.
Oh, you know what? That's actually not true. I mean, not about me not being a good human. I'm a great human. No, but good dancers, not always good humans.
I understand that. I guess for me, I evaluate maybe on different criteria, but I sensed in our interaction through the dancing and also communicating with you that you would be a person that I would see as a kindred spirit.
And so we, over the years, I completely forgot about this. I moved into the house that you used to live in New Haven. Yeah. It became a blues house. It became a dance house. We danced a lot there, and then we traveled a lot to at least a few dance exchanges, right?
Yeah, I think we were in New York at least once, and I don't remember Boston another time. Mm-hmm. And those are the two that I'm thinking of, but there might be another one.
Well, we also, we've done a lot of traveling together, because we went and we lived in Turkey together.
We did. Istanbul. We lived in Istanbul, right?
For 2 months. Dope. It was.
And you found the apartment. That was what I was so thankful for, because I was so nervous about looking for an apartment, and you found it.
Oh my God, we found the best apartment with
it's true.
two gay Turkish men that were living together. We looked out the window. There were umbrellas hanging in the streets.
It was a really epic place.
It was. And meanwhile, their country was in turmoil, and I guess kind of still is. Erdogan was just had his referendum, and basically became a de facto autocrat, as I understand it. So very tense times.
It was very tense.
Yeah, and I remember I was writing. I was a journalist at that time. You were a Christian secret agent.
I was, and that's actually my formal title.
You were doing. We can't talk about it much. I actually still don't know exactly what you were doing.
I worked with refugees. I worked in medical refugee services. That's what I was involved with.
Right. Yeah. And I remember I wrote an article about doctors, refugee Syrian doctors treating refugees in Turkey.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was a great time.
It was. Okay, so long-winded explanation about who you are, who we are.
We have a long history.
We do. We've got a fun history.
It's true.
All right. But yeah, so right now, and the thing that, I want to talk with you about on this podcast is coexistence. And particularly, we'll start with coexistence, in the religious sense, in the religious sphere. But then we can branch out, because the election is coming up, and there's all sorts of questions
about. Got to talk about it.
how and if we can coexist in the weeks and months to come. But where are you right now in terms of what are you doing?
So my name is Christian, and that is pretty fortuitous, because I am a minister. I'm actually an ordained minister. I think currently in 3 or 4 denominations. It depends on and actually maybe 6. It depends on the day or who's counting. But my formal title, I'm a reverend, and I serve as the director and campus minister in Manhattan, Kansas, the Little Apple, at Kansas State University. And my role is to facilitate and work in an organization that was started called Ecumenical Campus Ministries, That's a funny slip because that was an old name from like 10 years ago. Ecumenical campus ministries, and ecumenical in the sense of the history of Christianity has meant to collaborate across lines of difference in the tradition, across denominations. But what we do at ECM in Manhattan is we actually are working on an interfaith, interbelief, and spirituality concept, which also includes those who do not identify as religious, or who are really engaged in asking questions and exploring their own identity as it relates to their faith and spiritual selves, and sometimes arrive at just wanting to be in that place of thinking and meaning making, and that's a really wonderful thing. So we support this very perhaps eclectic, I think of it as very rich community of folks who are very intent on asking what it means to function and live together amidst difference, but also how to support one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a question that kind of goes way back. I mean, for as long as there has been religion, there has been infighting between religions and within religions,
Sure.
and for as long as there have been human cultures and societies, there has been similar dynamics. It seems like that is an oh so human characteristic, and I guess with religious coexistence, it strikes me as particularly difficult, whether you're religious or non-religious. Existing in a country, in a space with these different perspectives is difficult because they are essentially different metaphysical perspectives. You can agree on how your morals, your how you ought to live for the most part, but also at the very same time have completely different views on what is going on out there, beyond the curtain. I guess how with your work, does that come up more often, like the theological metaphysical part, or is it more of a down to earth, like this is how you should live your life, like, this is right, this is wrong? What tends to come up more?
I think that's an interesting framework. So it's important to frame that K-State is also an agricultural school. And so in a lot of ways, I think that people in those contexts, it's a public agricultural school, really are connected to the earth and the ground. And so this analogy of groundedness and like pragmatics, I feel like, is pretty predominant or prominent in people's questions.
Are there many pagans?
I think it would surprise people how religiously diverse at least college communities are in Kansas. I actually went to school and went to undergrad at the other state school. There's actually 3 major state schools in Kansas, which I think is cool. But I went to KU, so I'm at K-State and I attended KU. And there was a lot of conversation around religiosity and spirituality there. And I think there is also at K-State. It tends to be because Kansas, I think, has been perceived as being a place of having more conservative, theological, evangelical, fundamentalist ideas, that there's also a lot of folks that are attracted to conversations around challenging those norms. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would surprise people how many folks identify as pagan, how many folks identify and are like actively involved in questioning those social norms and those religious norms, because it's so much a part of the political spectrum in this area. So in that sense, like, I think there's a lot of pragmatic ways of engaging with one another. And so that's important, but that doesn't mean they're not theological in nature. And so a lot of the times, like, what I see myself doing and what I try and think about in the context of facilitating community is that we're really trying to create a space for imagination, for people to have like robust imaginations around what it means to be in a space together, and also like that it's okay to be curious, that it's okay to not come in with an orthodoxy or an orthopraxy. And if you have, like, let's ask questions about how does that provide meaning to your life? How do these other ideas provide meaning in other folks' lives, and what does that look like, and why does that matter? So I would say that's a really robust part of what's happening, and in a meaningful, intentional, like very sincere way.
Mm-hmm. I guess on the topic of coexistence, I recently heard a quote attributed to Rumi that the lamps may be different, but the light is the same.
I love that.
And it's at least among certain traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, for example, it's really a single through line. It's a single God that, while there are different names and different interpretations of that divinity, there is a through line there. And you see another kind of region of similar kinds of attitudes towards the metaphysical: Buddhism, Jainism, kind of Hinduism a little bit as well. And I guess it feels to me that as though atheism is kind of the biggest departure from all that, because in a sense, there's a real questioning of like, well, is there a light, or are there only lamps? Are there many atheists on campus, and what is their perspective, and how do they contribute to the conversation?
I feel like it's important for me to locate that I am not, I am not in the active in an atheist community in terms of like those conversations on campus. And so I don't want to try and speak for everyone. My experience is based on the things that I've seen at ECM and the conversations we've been engaged with. So that I want to make sure that I name that. But I think that a lot of the communities that I've spent time with or seen, or folks that identify as atheists that are involved at ECM, often are in spaces of really intentionally engaging the histories that they've encountered as it relates to Christianity. And there's a lot of deep curiosity about how things came to be. How do these ideas in Christianity exist? Why do they exist? And there's a sense of like wanting to be present in conversations and deep engagements about different types of meaning. And so I feel like those are the types of experiences that I've seen the most, and the ones that I'm able to speak to, just because those are the folks that are active in the community. I'm involved on a committee called I'm sorry if I mess this up for anyone that listens to this, the President's Committee on Religious, Spiritual, and Non-Religious Diversity. And it is a committee that advises the president
of the university, or?
Yes,
Okay.
that advises the president on, the president of the United States. No, that was last week. So of the university on these questions on campus, and we have an active atheist presence on that group. And we just recently had an event where atheists were involved in creating a kind of a talking session where they shared about their ideas and asked other questions of other communities, like, well, how do you think about this or perceive atheism? And it was actually Zoom bombed by an alt-right group that was very engaged in discriminatory language. And I think while it may seem like that makes sense in Kansas, that you can just kind of flippantly point to that being something that happens, I don't necessarily experience that to be how everyone functions, and that there is this, I would say that Trump has animated, and the politics around Trump, that animated ideas that if anyone doesn't form or fall into the kind of white Christian narrative, that they're seen as alien and other and bad and different. And so there's a lot of, in that way, like, I think also the people that are involved at ECM, the students and community members, have shared experiences with atheists in that space, where they're not necessarily have the same ideas, but they're also like feeling very nervous and bullied, and that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah. Those groups who are being very vocal and discriminatory in many ways. And so that's not necessarily the same experience, but certainly something that is happening across the spectrum.
Yeah, I was speaking with Nick Fish, the president of American Atheists, and he was saying that he's actively working on building coalitions with other groups, LGBT communities, and also, interestingly enough, other religious communities, which have felt the kind of heat or pressure, discrimination of predominantly evangelical conservative forces. And so he's also very, very aware that there aren't enough atheists, at least not enough openly atheist people to really fight a good fight, but maybe together with a coalition there might be.
And I think that's an important point, that I mean there are differences, and I don't want to muddy those or say that they're not important, because I believe, for example, and I tell people that one of the reasons I went into ordained ministry is because I had a strong group of Muslim women that I met with on a regular basis, that like we talked about theology, and I became super interested in understanding my own history and tradition, because these women were so committed to thinking about that with me. And so I think there's a way that we can enrich one another and think about, coexistence not as truth telling to each other, but kind of creating a space where we can explore who we are and how we create understanding alongside one another. And so I think that's a great moment or space where, even if you don't have, again, the same belief systems or structures, there's still coalitions to be built. There's still conversations to be had. And in fact, you can enrich one another's lives, like in very intentional ways. And that's amazing. And I think should be. And so I'm excited to hear that your friend is engaged in that. And I hope others can also be a part of thinking around those lines too.
Yeah. Well, all of that is well and good if the people involved are willing to have conversations.
Absolutely.
And so, what we were touching upon last time we tried to record this podcast was that there are certain people out there that are not willing to have, conversations. They're not really willing to coexist. Can you speak about, the alt-right presence on campus, and, what is that like, and what is it like to, to have a Zoom conversation that gets Zoom bombed by one of these groups?
Well, again, I was not on that conversation. Actually, one of the women that serves on our board was one of the moderators, and so has a lot more experience about that, and was describing sort of a debrief they had, because it was very difficult and traumatizing to have that happen in the middle of a conversation. And I think if anyone has ever done any research in the news on Kansas State, they'll find that over the last 4 years, although this extends further into the past, that there have been public displays of what we refer to as alt-right. I would say like outright racist, homophobic, white supremacist moments of trying to use fear to exclude others and to exert a presence in the community of Manhattan. And I think as a community, what I have valued about being here is that there is a strong sense of that being wrong by a lot of people, that it's not just that there are people and there are organizations that have collectively been organizing against these ideas for a long time, because these groups have had political vestiges sometimes in Kansas and in the Midwest. And so the history of being active and creating organizations is a part of kind of the lifeblood of a lot of Kansas communities. And so there's already been a very large, I would say, we don't believe this, we don't agree with this is not a part of who we are as a community. And so in that sense, I think what you were asking about earlier is like, what is the baseline for engagement? And if you're not able to acknowledge or recognize that someone has a shared humanity, if someone else's humanity is seen as a threat or something that you need to control, that's probably not going to be a good place to look at things like coexistence, because the negation of another person that doesn't create mutuality.
Right. In a sense, kind of like pluralism runs out there, the continent, the island of pluralism,
Sure.
stops where you reach a community or a person or a set of people that is unwilling to acknowledge, kind of, an equality, of mutual dignity and mutual respect among people. If it's one thing to disagree about interpretations, philosophies, even morality, in the religious sphere or the cultural sphere, but to not have at least a common understanding that we are all humans trying to make something work, that essentially all conversations will break down from the get-go. And so in the situation like that, is, you said it yourself. I mean, like that, coexistence can't happen there. What what are the next steps? Like, what happens from there?
Absolutely. Well, I think that we're seeing it on a national scale, and we're also experiencing it here. There are these relationships between organizations where folks are like, hey, listen, we clearly have something that we share. We need to create some kind of bridge because our voice is amplified when we do that. And so, I mean, that's again what we're seeing here at K-State. We're seeing groups, I think, forming, and inner, if you will, regional groups forming to say, we got to figure out how to make the perception of alt-right power lessened, and we need to amplify the voices of those who do not understand or perceive the world to be that. And so that's been a lot of what ECM has been involved with. We just had a queer cabaret on Sunday that was outdoors that people could participate in, and utilized that opportunity to think and to share with community flourishing and celebration. So, in moments of fear, we have decisions that we can make. And certainly those are, I'm not trying to speak to everyone's context, but it's been encouraging to see communities form and opportunities bubble up that says we are present, we are visible, we matter, and we have life to celebrate too. And so I think that those types of moments are powerful in and of themselves because they demonstrate an alternative narrative, an alternative vision of flourishing. And so that's something that, again, I think has to happen and is happening on a very real scale.
Mm-hmm. Right now in our country, we have people that have worldviews that are political worldviews that are essentially, almost non-overlapping. And it's interesting to think about this because it's in some ways very similar to two different religious worldviews, two different metaphysical worldviews that are completely incompatible with one another. When you can't agree on the baseline of reality, it's very easy, I think, to come to blows. And oftentimes through history, it's been through physical warfare, through kinetic warfare. More and more with time, we've transitioned into using diplomacy instead of warfare as a way to resolve conflicts. I've heard this political historian, David Moss, talk about how, in the history of democracy, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, he says, that in the most divisive periods of American, political history, there's been really interesting innovation that has come out of that because of that conflict. I'll read a quote from his book, Democracy, a Case Study. He says that, what struck me in working on these case studies is that in nearly every moment of American history, people thought democracy was about to break. In one instance, the Civil War, they were right. But most of the time, they were wrong. In part because they acted, became more engaged, and worked for reforms. Their hypochondria, if I can call it that, he says, the repeated fear that democracy was sick was ultimately good for the political system because it promoted action and engagement. And so maybe, maybe, fingers crossed, knock on wood, that this current, era that we're in is not going to lead to a giant split and a second, God forbid, civil war, but is actually something that is a healthy part of our democracy that is, making us much more engaged individually and collectively in the direction that our country is going in.
I think that's kind of, when I hear those types of things and experiences, I value them for the kind of attempt or the hope of having an objective look at what's happening. As someone who's in ministry and works kind of on the ground, these moments of strain are very stressful. They're they're very real and lived. So for example, we've had homelessness rates increase. Food insecurity increases. People are having to make very difficult decisions about, can I afford medicine, or do I have to Or how can I feed myself? And not that those things weren't happening previously, because we do have these discrepancies already in the United States of inequity, but I feel like they've been heightened, at least in my own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think naming the hopefulness that I hear in that quote, and also hoping that being engagement and looking towards engagement and talking about engagement as being important. I also think it's important to name that those moments are hard and often that are weathered differently, depending on so many different factors. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind too, that the lived experience that's happening, while it may end up not ending in a civil war, still doesn't make it, something that is an easy transition, or something that is, to be celebrated in that sense. I don't want people to be hungry. I don't want people to have to make decisions about medical care. That shouldn't exist, and needs to not be a part of the process as best as it can. And so that's something that I'm always mindful of, just working on the ground and seeing the kinds of things that I see in my role.
Yeah. It is very hard, and it's very hard right now because, for so many reasons, even among families, people have been and are being divided by whole world views that just seem to be so incompatible. And this has obviously so much to do with the kind of information ecology that we currently live in, where people are they're seeing different information. There's either a trust or distrust of totally different kinds of news sources, information sources. And yeah, I see my roommate has a tough time talking with his father. My mother and sister, I know, have come to very tense places, and it is very difficult to have these conversations and maintain your calm, maintain sight of your the commonality that you have. Do you have any ideas or suggestions for those people who want to engage, how to do that?
That's a good question, and one with much nuance, but I can think about it maybe from different angles. I think that some people need to remain calm. I, for example, as a white woman with some modicum of privilege, my role, I feel like in this moment, is to, as I said, listen and walk alongside people and support folks. I think other people, it's okay to be angry. I think that there's a place for anger. Certainly in the Christian context, there is lots of righteous anger. And often that is framed in a negative way, like, oh, you're going to hell, or oh, you've sinned. But I also think that people can be angry about the situation at hand because of the injustices that are happening. And so for those who are in a space of anger, I acknowledge that, and even think from my own context that can be okay. I think that if you're talking about trying to engage like with parents or family, certainly that's a different type of conversation than if you're in a protest and leading a protest, or involved in those types of organizing activities. But in terms of we'll talk about, if you're in a family setting and you're at dinner and things are hard, it's okay, I would say, and to recognize and understand your own limits, that, in some ways it's really difficult, not only because you feel angry or invested because this is someone you care about or that you look up to. I mean, you have a relationship. And so that it makes sense to acknowledge that that's difficult. I think when people are in a space where they feel like they're able to engage, if it comes to that spot, then reminding yourself that trying to come from a place of curiosity is important, not necessarily because the other person will reciprocate that, but because it allows you to kind of be in a mind frame of engaging with someone else. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't think that's everyone. Everyone doesn't need to be there. If you are a gay son and your father is telling you, or mother is telling you, or a parent is telling you that you are awful, and you know what, if that's not a healthy place for you, don't do that. Don't, because I get that. But if you're really invested in conversation, then coming from a place of, I'm curious about where you're coming from, maintaining, I actually often when I'm in a space where I feel like I'm going to be stressed, I will meditate before I go do something like that, if I know that I'm going to be in that spot. Yeah, because it allows you to kind of be like, okay, I'm in my space. This other person is in their space. I'm going to just be living into my space. Obviously, that's a lot of prep work, but
Prep work, I think, is important.
absolutely.
I mean, meditating, for me personally, I imagine the conversation and I imagine it going well, beforehand.
Oh, that's nice. That's such a good idea. I love that. You should write these things down. I think that acknowledging during a conversation, I try and say things like, I value you. Because I'm assuming that if you're engaging in this conversation, that you value that person. I want you to know that I care about you, like saying those things out loud. And I feel like
that can be huge. I mean, it just reminds them that, okay, we do have a bond that we're trying to maintain.
Right.
And yeah.
Right. So I think that some of those ways of creating reciprocity are helpful. And then if you're at a place where you are like, you know what, I've done what I can, and this is the end of what I can do, then you just leave. And if you're really continuing to engage, then remaining in that mindset is helpful. And sometimes I think it's good to think of successes, but it's also good not to idealize. Like, you're probably at the end of your conversation if someone thinks that Donald Trump is the descendant of the Lord, and you're not in that same spot, like, you're going to have a different outcome. Like, your outcome probably isn't going to be that the person, acknowledges that you have been correct for all of time, but just says, okay. Or, you're really, conversations are planting seeds. Conversations are planting seeds more than convincing people that they are in a different place than you are.
Yeah. And I like that framework a lot. It reminds me of, so Anthony Magnabosco is somebody that I know who he's an agnostic, an atheist, and he does street epistemology. Basically, it's a fascinating technique to basically get people to consider, not to challenge their beliefs directly, but to get them to consider how they came to their beliefs. So look at the epistemology, their way of knowing, and ask them to consider, is that way of knowing foolproof? Are you sure about how you got to where you got?
Do you know who else would love that? Socrates. Socrates would love that. Socrates would eat that up.
Yeah, I believe that was part of his diet. I think that was the Socratic.
No question.
Yeah, the Socratic diet. Yeah, but Anthony, one of his tips is, he does these videos online where he's talking about people about, deeply held beliefs of theirs, and when he sees somebody, pausing to think, he lets them pause. He lets them think rather than continuing to talk, because that's when real change is happening. When they are not responding immediately, gears are turning. And there's many of his conversations, they don't end with like a complete reversal.
Nope.
But maybe weeks or even months or sometimes years later, somebody will get in touch with him. It's like, you've changed my mind. Like, it wasn't then, but like it planted that seed, and over time, I really started thinking more deeply about this stuff, and I've come around to a different form of looking at things.
Absolutely. And that's the fostering curiosity. You're really, in my opinion, again, this is maybe coming from my ministry background, but I don't see myself as being like the converter of humanity. I don't care. I don't even care about that. If there is any type of like converting, which I hate that word, that happens, it's this sense of like being comfortable thinking about things. Like, I just think being open to like asking and thinking seems to be a really great place to be, because it is not someone's role, in my opinion, again, to think that we can autocratic each other into thinking or being the same way. We should really be seeing each other as like companions in this journey, for many reasons. Like, we all come from different contexts, and this is important, and this frames how we are. So I love that. And I think that, again, setting that realistic expectation and not seeing it as a failure. I feel like because people are so used to like, I've checked the box of like making someone think like me, that really isn't a healthy way to engage with people. You're really just perpetuating some of the things that maybe you don't want someone else to do to you. And so imagining yourself as being someone who is curating imagination and curiosity and capacity, that feels like a better spot not only for your own, like, okay, this is my outcome, but also like being recognizing and acknowledging that other person has a brain and is a human and is capable of, hopefully, processing and thinking about themselves, and that you get to be a part of that. What a joy.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I want to go back to something you mentioned before about the role of anger right now, but also in general. You know, there's I totally agree with you in the sense that there is plenty to be angry about right now for various reasons. You know, sometimes it feels like, you know, anger is a natural expression of, you know, when people think something is wrong, something they're deeply passionate about, you know, something in the world not being fair, not being just, not being equitable, and anger is an expression of that. But the question is, like, when, if, does anger have a place in changing politics and changing the world, in the sense of when anger becomes aggressive force, when anger becomes violence, is
Sure.
that still a legitimate expression, you know, or you know, does that divide ultimately more than it, you know, mends?
I think that's kind of maybe the question, one of the questions. For me, I don't know who said this, so if someone knows, they should quote, but someone once described to me the difference between hot anger and cold anger. And that has been helpful for me. And I wish I could think of who it was. I don't know if I read it or someone said it, but I think it's pretty helpful. Hot anger is that like explosion where you're like, you know, the all the things that come with yelling or screaming or feeling like really maybe even violent in that sense, like you're just in that hot anger spot. And I want to say that, like, one of the things I think that Christianity has done poorly is separating the body from the experience. Like there's this theology, especially from Aristotle, of like suppressing the human. Like there's all this suppression. We have to suppress our feelings. And so I think one of the things that is important to challenge, at least again from my perspective, is this sense of like, it's okay, you're going to have feelings. Like people have feelings. And that includes anger, like feel that anger. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there's a difference between hot anger and acting out of hot anger and acting out of cold anger, or the sense of like, anger can be animating. Anger is animating. And I'm angry about a lot of things. I'm angry about some of the histories of my tradition. And some of that has propelled me into thinking about leadership because I don't agree with those things. But I don't feel like, you know, from my perspective, I'm running around saying that I'm angry at the Crusades or something, which I am angry about, or I do feel upset about, or, you know,
so cold anger, what is it? Some examples?
So cold anger is just what I would think of as this, like, of the animation of like, I have ruminated on this. Mm-hmm. This is a part of my understanding of where I'm at. This is motivating for me. Like I see this as a social problem or a social concern, and I want to actively participate in this conversation and contribute to it in some capacity, knowing that that can mean a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like for me, when I think about what does it mean to act out of anger, I like that framework of cold anger because I can make decisions. Like I can acknowledge someone else's humanity, even if they disagree with me. I'm really not able to do that in my hot anger spot. Right. So that's sort of how I frame it.
That's a really good framework. And, you know, I think it's right in the context of a conversation, like let's say a family conversation with someone with very different views. You know, I was talking with my sister about having conversations like this with our mother, and, you know, when the wave of the conversation, when it starts to crest, when it starts to turn, and you start to turn into, I guess, yeah, once that hot anger starts, you know, you essentially
can feel
lost.
It, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you feel it, and you've lost the conversation because you know, especially if one person triggers another person, and, you know, like both people are you know, entering into that hot anger state where it feels like their identity and their core beliefs are being challenged. And
absolutely,
you know, it really is hard to bring it back from that. It's just a kind of exponential emotional curve. And but cold anger, from my understanding of it's something that you're talking from a place of, right, of you've thought about it. It's something that you've internalized. You are committed. It's like a resolve.
I like that.
And it can come through in your words and in your conversation, but it's not like a blinding, uncontrolled rage.
Sure. I think that you paraphrased it and added helpfully how I think of, or how I interpret that as well.
Yeah. I wanna say that maybe it was on Hidden Brain, that the psychology podcast. I feel like I've heard of them talking about anger, but it could be a completely different place.
Sure. We actually hosted a theology of anger conference at ECM 2 years ago and had a whole conversation around what does anger mean in the context of Christianity? What is anger like? Is there righteous anger? What is this? So we were discussing that, and I cannot think of what it was, who said that, or what it was from, but I was like, I'm taking that with me from this. So.
Excellent. Yeah. So I guess I think these are really useful concepts. I would it because we're so close to the election, like whatever conversations could have happened, whatever change could have happened, it's probably too late to really be having these conversations at the final hour. But I think at this point, it comes down to the electoral system that we've established, and which is really, if you think about it, it is a infrastructure to have these kinds of conversations on a nationwide scale. I think voting is, I believe, an act of faith. It's an act of faith that what we've been involved in, this enterprise for the last 300 years, is really is working, or can work better and better than it has worked in the past. I think that's what is kind of at the heart of the American constitutional system: amendments and distribution of power, checks and balances. It's the ambition to, over time, slowly but surely, correct and adjust. And I have great faith and hope that will continue.
Hope is so important.
Yeah. Hope backed up with action.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I hope everybody goes and uses their voice, uses their vote, and
do it.
It is an act of faith. And Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And one more thing. Is there a word that you want to add to the Athesaurus? It is a thesaurus for atheists, for agnostics, for those who do not believe, and yet who want to express very deep and potent human emotions without using words like soul or transcendent or divine.
I think there's a word, I think it is pneuma. I may be saying it wrong. And it is, I like the word, it's kind of a translation for spirit, but I don't think that it comes with the baggage that you're describing.
Is that PNEUM?
Yes, M-A.
So spell it?
PNEUMA.
Okay. Pneuma. Yeah. Pneuma. And that's from the same root that pneumatic is. Yeah. Of lungs, of breath.
Yes. It means it's used in John. People don't know this, and that's why it's kind of cool. Or maybe they do. Maybe everyone knows this, and I'm the only one that thinks this is novel. But it means to like breathe spirit or breath onto something. And so
it's an old Greek word, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think that pneuma, I think that's it's also kind of a sciencey word.
Yeah, it's used. It's bandied about among in scientific labs.
It is. It does mean spirit, so that I don't know if that is helpful or not, but that would be the word that's the word that came to my mind when you said that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christian.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.